She called the cops on me for standing on my own dock. Imagine that, sirens blazing down a quiet lakeside road, neighbors peeking through curtains, all because one woman with a clipboard decided she owned the water under my feet. I thought it was a misunderstanding, some silly HOA rule blown out of proportion. But then the flyers appeared, my face plastered on lampposts like I was a wanted criminal. Strangers whispered that I was trespassing on land my grandfather left me. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about fees or maintenance, it was about power. She wanted the whole lake, my lake, and she was willing to destroy me to take it. When I first came back to my grandfather's lakeside cabin, I thought I'd finally found peace. The cabin had been sitting empty for nearly 2 years after his passing, tucked between tall pines and the steady shimmer of the lake. I wanted to breathe again after years of living in cramped apartments, moving from lease to lease, always feeling like a guest in someone else's life. Here on this land, I could stretch out. I could hear the water lapping against the wooden dock and feel like I belonged. The morning I finished unpacking, I remember the stillness. Mist hovered over the water, and I stood by the dock arranging the bright orange buoys I'd bought with the money I'd saved from my job as a water safety instructor. They marked the property line, at least the one I believed to be mine, based on the old survey posts my grandfather had hammered into the earth decades ago. I thought nothing of it. I was just doing what came naturally, keeping the water safe, keeping my space organized. That's when the crunch of gravel broke the quiet. A woman appeared at the end of the driveway, moving with the self-importance of someone used to being obeyed. She was in her late 50s, hair stiff with hairspray, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. She introduced herself as Marjorie Kane, president of the Lakeshore Homeowners Association. I had never heard of such an association. "Welcome to our community," she said, her smile stretched so tight it looked like it hurt. Without waiting for me to invite her inside, she shoved a stack of papers at me. It was a contract, $200 initiation fee, plus $175 a month for lake maintenance and community improvements. I blinked. "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in joining an HOA. Her smile collapsed instantly. Her spine straightened like she was about to scold a schoolchild. "Nobody lives on this lake without joining. Nobody. This is community property, and we all pay our fair share." I laughed nervously, trying to stay polite. "Well, I've been paying the property taxes for 2 years. My grandfather left me this place, and I don't recall seeing anything about an HOA in the deed." The next moment was like watching a switch flip inside her. Her voice rose shrill and cutting. "You're trespassing every single time you step onto that dock. Every time you put a buoy in the water, you're stealing from the community. And if you refuse to comply," she held up her phone, "I'll have no choice but to call the police." I froze. Surely she was bluffing. Surely no one would actually call the cops over a disagreement about monthly dues. But right there on my porch, with me still holding one of the buoys in my hand, Marjorie dialed 911 and reported me as if I were a criminal. I couldn't believe it. My stomach dropped as I heard her reciting my address to the dispatcher, her voice full of righteous fury. I kept thinking, this has to be a mistake. She can't actually think she owns this lake. 20 minutes later, the flashing lights arrived. Officer Daniel Bennett stepped out of his cruiser with the weary look of someone who'd been dragged into too many neighborhood squabbles. He listened to Marjorie's dramatic claims that I was brazenly exploiting community resources, then turned to me for my side. I told him the truth. My grandfather left me the land, I paid the taxes, and as far as I knew, the lakefront was mine to use. Bennett scribbled notes in his pad, finally snapping it shut with a sigh. "This sounds like a civil matter," he said flatly. "Not a criminal one." Marjorie's face flushed crimson. She jabbed a finger toward the water. "I hereby declare the dock closed until further notice," she barked like she was a judge issuing a sentence. The officer gave her a long, tired look, then walked back to his car without another word. I stood there on the porch, my hands trembling, while Marjorie stormed away. The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. I walked down to the dock and stared at the orange buoys floating gently in the water. Suddenly, they looked like evidence in a crime I hadn't committed. Had I misunderstood my grandfather's deed? Was there some obscure rule buried in county records that gave the HOA a claim? That night I dug through every dusty box in the basement searching for clarity. My grandfather had been meticulous, keeping every receipt, every tax return, every scrap of paper. But his filing system was like a labyrinth, handwritten notes scrawled in margins, yellowing survey maps rolled up and tied with string. Finally, buried in a folder marked property lines, I found an old survey stamped with the county seal. The words lake surface rights were written in dense legal language I couldn't fully understand, but my gut told me it mattered. As I sat there, surrounded by stacks of paper, I realized something chilling. Marjorie wasn't bluffing. She truly believed she controlled this lake. and she wasn't going to stop until I either paid her fees or surrendered. I stared at that survey until my eyes blurred. One thought echoed in my mind, louder than the rest. What is she hiding about this lake? The fight had only just begun. The morning after that confrontation, I thought maybe things would settle down. Maybe Marjorie had just been on some kind of power trip and would let it go. But I was wrong. I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the street outside, louder than usual. When I looked through the blinds, two neighbors I didn't recognize were walking slowly past my house, not casually like people out for a stroll, but deliberately scanning my yard as if they were on patrol. One of them even paused to take a photo with his phone before moving on. An hour later, I found the first flyer taped to my mailbox. My heart lurched as I read the bold red letters, screaming across the top, "Unauthorized lake usage by new resident." Beneath the headline was a grainy photo of me standing on my own dock buoys floating in the background. The text accused me of stealing community resources and warned neighbors to be vigilant. I crumpled the paper in my fist, but when I drove into town that afternoon, I realized the flyer was everywhere on lampposts, pinned to the grocery store bulletin board, even tucked under car windshields in the church parking lot. My face had been turned into a public warning. That night my phone buzzed with notifications from a group chat I didn't even remember joining. "Community Concern Lake Access Situation," the title read. The messages were relentless. Some neighbors wrote in confusion asking about the property boundaries. Others jumped straight to hostility, calling me a freeloader, a trespasser, a thief. A few even suggested organizing watch rotations to monitor my activity by the water. I felt like I was living inside a courtroom where the jury had already decided I was guilty. But what chilled me the most wasn't the neighbors. It was Marjorie's tone in the chat. She was calm, polished, authoritative. Every message she sent dripped with certainty. "The HOA has documentation. This resident is refusing to cooperate. We must protect community rights." She wrote like a politician giving a speech, never raising her voice but making sure the spotlight stayed on me as the villain. The pressure mounted quickly. Cars slowed as they drove past my house. People whispered in pairs on the sidewalk. Even the local diner waitress, who'd been warm and chatty when I first moved in, now gave me a tight smile and hurried away when I ordered breakfast. By the third day, it felt like I was under surveillance in my own home. One evening, as I was bringing in groceries, I noticed orange surveyor's flags stuck in the ground along my backyard. They hadn't been there the day before. Someone had walked onto my property at night and planted them, creating random boundaries that didn't match any map I'd ever seen. I carefully pulled them out and photographed everything, storing the evidence in my garage. But the message was clear. Marjorie wasn't just fighting me with words. She was escalating, trying to rattle me, trying to push me into submission. What made it worse was the silence of the people around me. Not everyone seemed convinced by Marjorie's crusade. I could tell by the way some neighbors avoided her rallies or glanced uncomfortably when she spoke. But nobody spoke up in my defense. The fear of crossing her seemed too strong. The tipping point came when I stopped at the post office. As I was leaving, I overheard two older men talking near the bulletin board. One of them waved a copy of the flyer in his hand. "You know," he said, "Marjorie's been running that HOA like her personal kingdom for years. First, it was the lawn regulations, then the fence disputes. Now it's the lake. She doesn't stop." His friend shook his head. "But this kid, he won't stand a chance. She's got half the neighborhood convinced he's a criminal already. You fight Marjorie, you lose. That's just the way it is." I got into my truck, my pulse hammering. Their words stung not just because they doubted me, but because it sounded like they'd already seen this story play out before with other victims who gave up rather than fight. That night, unable to sleep, I pulled out the dusty folder from my grandfather's basement again. I sat at the kitchen table under a single yellow bulb, flipping through old deeds, survey maps, and tax receipts. The deeper I went, the more convinced I became that the lake wasn't communal property at all. My grandfather had paid taxes on lake surface assessments every year, something I'd been continuing to do without question. Why would the county collect taxes on water he supposedly didn't own? I needed answers, real answers. So the next morning I drove into town to meet with an attorney whose name I'd found on the county website, Carlos Delgado. He was a sharp man in his 40s with a reputation for dealing in messy land disputes. I laid everything out on his desk, the flyers, the group messages. I'd printed out the survey documents from my grandfather's file. Delgado took his time scanning each page, occasionally raising his eyebrows. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Here's what I see," he said. "You've been paying property taxes that specifically reference lake surface rights. That alone carries weight. If the HOA has legitimate authority, they'd need to show incorporation documents and county filings. Without that, their power is paper thin. So, you're saying this HOA might not even be legal?" I asked. Delgado shrugged. It might exist, but not with the authority they're claiming. Homeowners associations are bound by strict state laws. If they're trying to extend their power over property that isn't deeded to them, that's fraud. And if they're collecting money without proper oversight, he tapped the flyers on his desk. Then you might be looking at something much bigger than a neighbor dispute. For the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't a trespasser. Something here was rotten, and maybe I had the proof to expose it. But as I drove home past more flyers, stapled to telephone poles, past neighbors giving me suspicious looks, I realized Marjorie wasn't going to back down. She was doubling down, and I had a sinking feeling that her campaign had only just begun. The war for the lake had moved from my front porch to the entire community, and I was completely outnumbered. The deeper I dug into my grandfather's files, the more tangled the truth became. Dust clung to my fingers as I flipped through folders filled with yellowing maps, tax assessments, and handwritten notes. He had been meticulous about keeping everything but his system, was coded in his own logic arrows, pointing to old deeds, dates, scribbled in margins, surveyor sketches, taped together with brittle masking tape. One word kept surfacing: easement. I didn't know the full legal weight of it, but I knew enough to sense it mattered. By the time I looked up from the papers, the clock read nearly 2 a.m. I could hear owls in the trees, the occasional ripple of fish in the lake. The house felt heavier than it had in years, like the walls themselves knew secrets I hadn't uncovered yet. The next day, I carried a stack of documents into town and met again with Attorney Delgado. He sat behind his desk, neat piles of case files stacked like towers around him. He studied my grandfather's survey, adjusting his glasses, then tapped his pen against the margin. "This right here," he said, pointing to a faded seal from the county clerk's office, "suggests your grandfather wasn't just a property owner along the shoreline. He held lake surface rights. That means legally the water within those boundaries is considered part of your property. Not communal, not HOA controlled. Yours." Relief surged through me, then fear followed right behind it. "But why does Marjorie sound so sure the HOA controls it?" Delgado leaned back. "Because most people don't read deeds or county codes. They hear HOA and assume authority. It's a bluff, but an effective one. And if she's collecting fees from your neighbors, she might have more to lose than just pride. She might be running something closer to embezzlement." The word hit me hard: embezzlement. This wasn't just a personality clash. It could be fraud. Delgado promised to research further, pulling county records that would confirm whether the Lakeshore HOA had ever been legally filed. But he warned me, she's not going to stop just because you have the law on your side. People like Marjorie build empires out of intimidation. If you push back, expect retaliation. I thought I was prepared for that. I wasn't. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, I walked down to my dock to clear my head. The water reflected the orange sky, peaceful in a way that mocked the storm brewing around me. That's when I noticed them, 3 neighbors standing at the edge of the property line watching. They weren't talking, just staring, arms crossed. One of them, a tall man with a baseball cap, muttered something I couldn't hear, and they all turned and walked off. I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't neighborly curiosity. This was surveillance. The next morning I found something new. Dozens of flyers had been stapled to utility poles all the way down my road. This time the headline was even more dramatic: "Trespasser refuses to comply, lake access suspended." Marjorie had added what looked like official seals and signatures, though I suspected they were as real as Monopoly money. But the effect was powerful. People driving by slowed down to read them. I even saw a group of teenagers rip one down, snicker, then glance nervously at my property like I was radioactive. It was working. Her campaign was isolating me. And then came the breaking point. Late that afternoon, a knock rattled my door. I opened it to find Marjorie herself, flanked by 2 neighbors I hadn't met. She carried a folder so thick it looked like a phone book bursting with papers and stamped pages. "These," she announced, laying them across my porch table like a lawyer presenting evidence to a jury, "prove beyond doubt that the Lakeshore HOA maintains full authority over the lake." I leaned closer trying to read, but she kept her hands positioned, just so, tilting the pages, so I saw only the official headers and seals, never the fine print. She tapped her manicured finger against a signature line: "Certified bylaws. Filed with the county clerk. Enforceable by law." Behind her, one neighbor nodded enthusiastically, while the other shifted uneasily, avoiding eye contact. It was a performance carefully choreographed to intimidate me. I kept my voice steady. "If those documents are legitimate, I'd like copies. I'll have my attorney review them." Her eyes narrowed. "You don't need an attorney. What you need is compliance. Every day you delay puts you further in violation. Do you understand?" I felt a spark of anger. What I understand is that I've been paying property taxes on this land, including lake assessments, for years. That's not how trespassing works. For the first time, her mask slipped. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. She recovered quickly, but I saw at the crack. One of the neighbors glanced at me, then at her, doubt etched across his features. Marjorie snapped her folder shut and stepped closer. This isn't going to end the way you think it will. If you want to avoid embarrassment, sign the papers now. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence was defiance enough. When she stormed off, I noticed something. The man who'd looked uneasy lingered a moment longer. He didn't say anything, but his hesitation spoke volumes. Not everyone in her little army believed her story. That night, unable to shake the unease, I stood on the dock again, the water dark and glassy under the moon. My grandfather had always told me the lake was ours, that it belonged to our family. I'd never questioned it until now. But watching those buoys bob gently in the current, I swore to myself I wouldn't let Marjorie steal it with lies and paperwork. What I didn't know then was that someone else in the neighborhood felt the same. Someone who had been quietly watching Marjorie's power games and keeping her own records. And she was about to reach out in a way that would change everything. By the time the weekend rolled around, the tension in the neighborhood had become impossible to ignore. People who once nodded politely as they walked their dogs now avoided eye contact. Cars slowed down as they passed my driveway, their drivers pretending to check their mirrors while staring straight at me. It was like I'd been recast in some community play where Marjorie was the heroine and I was the villain everyone loved to hate. Saturday morning, I got my first real glimpse of how far she was willing to go. I was sipping coffee by the kitchen window when I noticed movement near the dock. At first, I thought it was a couple of kids fooling around, but then I realized it was a group of adults, neighbors I barely knew, arranging themselves in a neat semicircle around the water's edge. Each held a sign, "Community Water Access Fair Fees for All, Stop Trespassing." And in the middle of it all, directing the scene like a Hollywood producer, was Marjorie Kane. Clipboard in one hand, phone in the other. She paced back and forth, snapping pictures, giving instructions, even adjusting the angle of a protester's sign so the words would face my house more clearly. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat, a staged protest at my dock. She wasn't just enforcing HOA rules. She was choreographing a narrative, one where she was the noble defender of community values, and I was the selfish outlaw threatening harmony. They stayed for almost an hour, chanting slogans. Marjorie clearly fed them. Pay your fair share, and this lake belongs to everyone. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. I stood just inside the window, camera in hand, documenting every second. If she wanted theatrics, I would counter with evidence. But the flyers, those were different. That afternoon, as I drove into town, I saw them plastered across storefronts and pinned to bulletin boards. Urgent community notice: unauthorized lake usage by new resident. My photograph, taken without my knowledge, was front and center, blown up and distorted until I looked like a mugshot. Underneath, the text accused me of flagrant boundary violations, refusal to cooperate, and endangering community trust. I pulled one down, crumpling it in my hand, but it was pointless. Everywhere I looked, people were reading them. Mothers at the grocery store whispered while glancing at me. A cashier's friendly tone turned clipped and professional the moment I swiped my card. It was working. Her smear campaign was spreading like wildfire. What really shook me was the email. That night, as I sat scrolling through the endless neighborhood group chat filled with accusations, an anonymous message landed in my inbox. It was written in formal, almost legal language, citing county ordinances and regulations I'd never heard of. It accused me of illegal encroachment and warned that further non-compliance will trigger civil remedies. But the email wasn't from the county. I knew that immediately. It was too vague, too conveniently aligned with Marjorie's talking points. She, or someone working with her, was fabricating official complaints to intimidate me. Still, the effect was brutal. My phone buzzed nonstop with group messages. Some neighbors asked pointed questions about whether I'd even bothered to check my deed. Others outright threatened to take matters into their own hands if I kept refusing to comply. The isolation was suffocating. The worst came late Sunday morning. I opened my front door to grab the newspaper and found another flyer, this one taped directly to the wood. But unlike the others, this one had bold red letters at the bottom: dock closed. Violators will be reported. It wasn't just a smear anymore. It was a threat plastered on my own property. That night, as I sat on the porch trying to breathe through the anxiety clawing at my chest, I noticed a figure approaching from the shadows. My first instinct was to brace for another confrontation, but then I saw her face, nervous, kind, almost apologetic. "Hi," she said softly, glancing over her shoulder like she didn't want to be seen. "I'm Sophie Miller. I live 3 blocks over. She held out a bottle of water as if that small gesture could break the tension hanging in the air. We sat on the steps and she spoke quickly, her voice hushed. I wanted to apologize for what's been happening. Not everyone supports Marjorie. Some of us, we've had our doubts for a long time. The fees keep going up, but nothing changes. The dock repair she promised never happened. The landscaping fund, nobody knows where it went. Her eyes flicked to the flyer, still taped to my door. She's good at controlling the story. Most people don't question her because they're afraid of being the next target. Before she left, Sophie pressed the empty bottle into my hand. I almost tossed it in the recycling bin, but when I looked closer, I noticed something wedged inside. A folded piece of paper. I slipped it out, heart pounding. Scrawled in neat handwriting were just a few words and a phone number. Text me. HOA finances aren't right. I stared at the note for a long time, the weight of it sinking in. Someone else saw through Marjorie's facade. Someone else had proof. The war for the lake wasn't just about boundary lines anymore. It was about money, lies, and control. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't fighting alone. Sleep didn't come easy after Sophie's visit. I lay awake most of the night, staring at the note she had tucked into that water bottle. The words burned in my mind, HOA finances aren't right. My heart raced with both fear and relief. Fear because this meant Marjorie's campaign wasn't just about power, it was about money, maybe even crime. Relief because I finally had confirmation I wasn't the only one who smelled rot behind her polished smile. The next morning I texted the number. I kept it short. What do you know? For a few tense minutes, nothing came. Then finally, too much to say here. Don't trust phones. Meet tomorrow. Coffee shop on Main. 9 a.m. Come alone. It felt like something out of a spy novel, but desperation has a way of pushing you into roles you never expected. The following day, I walked into the cafe, scanning for Sophie. She sat near the back, half hidden behind a stack of newspapers, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. When she saw me, she gestured subtly to the seat across from her. You're braver than I thought, she said, her voice low. Most people back down when Marjorie comes after them. I leaned forward. You said the finances aren't right. What do you mean? She slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were copies of HOA newsletters, old payment requests, and what looked like homemade spreadsheets. I've been keeping track. Marjorie collects fees for projects that never happen. Dock repairs, landscaping, even something about lake dredging. Thousands of dollars collected. No receipts. No contractors hired. Nothing. I thumbed through the papers. The numbers were staggering. So where's the money going? That's the question, Sophie whispered. And you're not the first person she's targeted. Last year, the Johnsons 2 streets over pushed back on a new flood insurance fee. Suddenly, flyers went up calling them unsafe homeowners. They moved within 6 months. Nobody's heard from them since. I felt my stomach twist. It was all falling into place. Her smear campaigns weren't just temper tantrums. They were weapons sharpened by years of practice. Before we parted, Sophie gave me one last warning. Be careful. The more you push, the uglier she'll get. She's used to winning. She was right. That very evening, Marjorie returned to my property, this time with even more neighbors at her side. She marched up the driveway with a stack of documents, her voice projecting like a stage actress. This resident, she declared to the small crowd, continues to trespass and endanger community harmony. We demand immediate compliance, or we will escalate to legal remedies. Her audience nodded along, though I noticed the same flickers of unease in some of their faces, the same cracks I'd seen before. But Marjorie was a master at drowning out doubt with volume. I stood on my porch, clutching Sophie's envelope inside my jacket. My voice shook, but I forced the words out. If you think you have legal authority, then let's take it to court. Otherwise, stop harassing me. For a moment, silence fell. Then Marjorie's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, we'll see you in court, all right. But by then, everyone will already know who you really are. The next morning, I woke to find new flyers, this time more aggressive. My face in bold print, the word trespasser stamped diagonally across the photo. The paper claimed I was refusing to pay mandatory community fees and stealing resources from honest families. My address was printed at the bottom, inviting anyone to witness violations firsthand. I tore one down, hands shaking. This wasn't just defamation anymore. This was targeted harassment bordering on dangerous. That afternoon, Officer Bennett showed up again. He looked tired, his notepad tucked under one arm. Got another complaint, he said flatly. Alleged continued trespassing. I could see Marjorie standing at the property line, arms folded, lips pursed in smug satisfaction. I took a deep breath and said the one thing I knew would matter. Officer, I'm still paying county property taxes, lake surface assessments included. For the first time, Bennett's expression shifted. He raised an eyebrow, scribbled something in his notepad. Lake surface assessments, you said? That's right. Every year since I inherited the place. Behind him, I caught the tiniest flicker of panic across Marjorie's face. Her mask slipped for less than a second, but it was enough. Bennett saw it too. He didn't call her out directly, but his voice hardened. Ma'am, this isn't a criminal issue. If you believe you have civil claims, you'll need to file through the court system. Otherwise, stop using law enforcement as a tool. Marjorie's cheeks burned red, but she said nothing. She gathered her papers with jerky movements, muttering something about next steps as she stormed away. For the first time since this began, I felt a spark of victory. Not a win, not yet, but the smallest sign that the tide could turn. That night, as I added more buoys to the water reinforcing the survey lines my grandfather had left behind, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just about me. If Sophie was right, Marjorie had been manipulating this community for years, bleeding it dry, one bogus fee at a time. If I backed down, she'd just find another target. I looked out across the water, the moonlight casting a silver path across the lake, and made a promise to myself. I would not let her win. By the time the annual water festival approached a supposedly cheerful neighborhood gathering by the community pavilion, the storm between me and Marjorie had turned into the main attraction. Everyone knew it. She knew it. And I knew it. For days, messages flooded the neighborhood group chat announcing that the festival would include a boundary map examination where residents could finally hear the truth about the lake dispute. Marjorie framed it like a civic duty, a public trial disguised as a picnic. She even bragged that she'd be bringing a lawyer, as if that alone proved her authority. I spent the night before the festival in my living room, surrounded by folders and equipment. Sophie sat across from me, her laptop glowing as she organized the spreadsheets she'd compiled. Her face was tense but determined. I've cross-checked everything twice, she said, tapping the screen. The numbers don't lie. Over $25,000 collected in fees. No receipts, no contractors, just vanished. I nodded, though my stomach churned. She'll try to twist it. She always does. That's why we show them the documents, not just the claims, Sophie said firmly. Facts, not theatrics. Easier said than done. Marjorie thrived on theatrics. The next morning, the pavilion buzzed with energy. Kids ran between picnic tables, while adults carried coolers and lawn chairs, oblivious to the war that was about to unfold. I spotted Marjorie immediately. She stood near a folding table draped with a blue cloth, stacks of binders, and laminated papers spread neatly across it. At her side was a man in a dark suit with a leather briefcase, the HOA lawyer she'd promised. Her smile radiated confidence as she greeted neighbors, shaking hands like a politician on election day. Every gesture screamed, "I am in control." Sophie and I exchanged a glance. She whispered, "Remember, steady calm. Let the evidence speak." When the examination began, Marjorie strutted to the microphone like it was her personal podium. "Neighbors," she began, her voice ringing out clear and commanding, "we gather here today to resolve a serious violation of our community's harmony. One resident has refused to join the HOA, refused to pay their fair share, and continues to exploit resources meant for all of us." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others crossed their arms. I saw doubt in a few eyes, but also suspicion aimed squarely at me. Then she gestured to the lawyer. He launched into a long-winded explanation of general HOA law, citing statutes about fee collection and property maintenance. It sounded authoritative, but it was vague, nothing that specifically applied to our lake. Still, the weight of his voice carried, and I felt the crowd leaning toward her side. My pulse hammered. When it was finally my turn, I carried my projector to the front. My hands shook as I set it up, but once the first image appeared, a county map overlaid with my property lines, I felt the room shift. The survey marks were clear, undeniable. The lake surface rights extended from my deed straight into the water. The buoys I'd placed aligned perfectly with the official boundaries. "This isn't just my claim," I said, forcing my voice steady. "These are county documents, filed, stamped, recorded. For years I've paid taxes specifically for these lake rights. If this was community property, why would the county charge me?" A hush fell. I caught glimpses of raised eyebrows, whispers darting between neighbors. For the first time I saw Marjorie's smile falter. Then Sophie stood up. She carried her own stack of papers, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with every word. "I've tracked the HOA's collections for the past 2 years. Over 8 families have paid lake fees, totaling more than $25,000. Not one improvement has been made. No contractors hired, no maintenance done. Where did that money go?" She spread the spreadsheets across a table for all to see. numbers lined up in neat columns impossible to dismiss. "We deserve answers," she finished, her voice sharp. The crowd erupted in murmurs. One man shouted, "Yeah, where is our money?" Another woman added, "I've been paying for years, nothing's changed." Marjorie's face flushed crimson. But just when I thought the tide had fully turned, she struck back with precision. She raised her voice above the noise. "And how did he?" She pointed at me, "Get these so-called documents. By breaking into my personal files, by spying on me, photographing private schedules and calendars. This man is not a victim, he's a stalker." Gasps spread through the pavilion. My chest tightened. I tried to explain. "That's not true. Sophie provided the records, and they only show financial inconsistencies." But my words sounded weak, defensive. Marjorie slammed her binder shut for emphasis. "Neighbors, do you see? He'll do anything to avoid paying his dues, even violate privacy, even twist numbers. Is that the kind of person you want living here, exploiting us all?" The mood shifted instantly. Murmurs turned into suspicious glances, narrowed eyes aimed at me instead of her. A few people clapped for Marjorie's fiery speech. Others just looked uneasy, caught between two stories they didn't fully understand. I felt my throat tighten. This was her talent, turning the spotlight, reframing herself as the victim, while casting me as the aggressor. And the worst part, the evidence Sophie and I had worked so hard to gather was now tainted by her accusations. As I looked around, I realized the battle wasn't over. If anything, it had only just begun. Because while the crowd's loyalty swung back toward her, I knew the truth. And I knew Sophie's numbers didn't lie. But if I wanted to expose her, I would have to be smarter than ever. The pavilion confrontation left me reeling. I walked home that evening with Sophie at my side, both of us silent, both of us carrying the heavy weight of failure. Neighbors who had seemed ready to question Marjorie were now avoiding eye contact again, whispering as we passed. The sting of betrayal was sharp. One mistake, one accusation about privacy invasion, and suddenly I was the villain again. Back at the cabin, I sat on the porch staring at the lake, its surface calm and innocent, as if mocking the chaos it had caused. Sophie broke the silence. "Don't give up," she said firmly. "What happened today wasn't about facts, it was about theater. And Marjorie's good at theater." I nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's time we beat her at her own game." That night I hatched a plan. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't safe. But it was the only way to make Marjorie expose herself. The next morning, I placed a fake document on my porch table, a supposed survey report, with vague property notes, and a faint watermark only visible up close. I knew Marjorie couldn't resist snooping. I added a tiny pencil dot in one corner, a mark invisible from a distance, but clear enough that I'd know if someone had studied it. Then I left it there in plain sight, and went about my day. By evening, the bait was taken. Marjorie stormed up my driveway with fire in her eyes, waving the document like a trophy. "Forgery," she shouted loud enough for neighbors to hear. "This is fraudulent. This man is creating fake surveys to trick you all." But her rage betrayed her. The only way she could have known about the document was if she'd come onto my property and read it. In her obsession to accuse me, she'd revealed what I suspected all along. She'd been watching me sneaking onto my land. Officer Bennett was called again, this time by her. When he arrived, I calmly explained, "If this document is fake, officer, then how did she know what it said? It was sitting on my porch inside my property line." For the first time, Bennett didn't look at me with weary resignation. He turned his eyes on Marjorie, studying her carefully. She sputtered, tried to redirect, but the doubt was there. I saw it flicker in his eyes. Still, Bennett stayed neutral. "Ma'am," he said, "if you have evidence of fraud, take it to civil court. But if you've been entering his property without permission, that's another issue entirely." Marjorie's face twisted with frustration. She muttered about protecting the community and stormed off. But I'd seen it. The crack in her armor was widening. That week, Sophie and I worked with Attorney Delgado. He dug into county filings, cross-referencing deeds, tax rolls, and incorporation records. What he found was damning. The Lakeshore HOA had never filed the necessary paperwork to claim management of the lake. Their bylaws were nothing but self-written documents with no legal standing. Worse, Delgado discovered inconsistencies in reported funds. The numbers Sophie tracked didn't appear anywhere in county records. "This isn't just a civil matter anymore," Delgado said, gravely sliding the papers back into a folder. "If she's collected fees under false pretenses, that's fraud. And if the amounts are large enough, it could be criminal." The truth was solidifying, but truth wasn't enough. Marjorie still controlled the narrative. She had neighbors in her grip, fueled by fear and misinformation. I needed a public moment, a stage where the evidence couldn't be twisted. That chance came sooner than expected. A message popped up in the neighborhood group chat: "Final resolution, Saturday Community Center." HOA will present official evidence. Non-compliant resident required to attend. It was exactly what I needed. The week leading up to the meeting I prepared meticulously. Delgado helped gather certified copies of deeds and tax statements. Sophie refined her spreadsheets, organizing them into a clear timeline. I tested a portable projector, ensuring I could display maps and drone footage across the center's large wall. No theatrics this time, just undeniable visuals. When Saturday arrived, the atmosphere was electric. The community center buzzed with residents, every folding chair filled. Marjorie stood proudly at the front with her lawyer stacks of binders arranged like ammunition. Her confidence was unshaken, at least on the surface. The meeting began with her lawyer once again, citing statutes and HOA regulations. But when I took the floor, I projected the official county map directly onto the wall, overlaying it with drone footage of my buoys and survey posts. The boundaries glowed under the projector's light, perfectly aligned with my deed. Gasps rippled through the room. This wasn't abstract paperwork anymore, it was visible proof right in front of their eyes. Marjorie tried to interrupt, but I pressed on. For years I've paid county taxes on this lake. Lake surface assessments. That is not community property. That is not HOA jurisdiction. That is ownership. Then Sophie stood up, her voice carrying with quiet conviction. She revealed her spreadsheets showing every dollar collected and every project that never happened. $25,000, she said, holding up the papers. Gone. No receipts, no contractors, no results. Where did the money go, Marjorie? The crowd erupted. Voices demanded answers. Faces turned angry, not at me this time, but at her. Marjorie's smile faltered, her hands tightening on the microphone. These are lies, she hissed. Twisted numbers from people who want to freeload. But the lawyer at her side closed his briefcase silently, his face pale. He knew. He wasn't going to defend her any further. The tide had turned. Neighbors who once glared at me now shouted at her. I paid you every month, one man yelled. Where's the money? Another added. You lied to us? Marjorie tried to fight back, but the noise drowned her. Her empire of intimidation was crumbling. I stood quietly, letting the crowd demand what I already knew: accountability. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the weight shift off my shoulders. But I also knew cornered animals fight hardest. And Marjorie wasn't done yet. The community center that day felt less like a meeting hall and more like a courtroom. The air buzzed with outrage, neighbors shouting over each other, demanding answers. And for once their anger wasn't directed at me. It was aimed squarely at Marjorie Kane. She stood frozen at the front, gripping her binder like a lifeline. Her lawyer had already retreated, closing his briefcase, avoiding eye contact, and slipping quietly toward the door. That was the moment it sank in for everyone. If her own legal counsel wouldn't defend her, what did that say about her case? Sophie pressed the advantage. You told us fees were for dock repairs, but no contractor was ever paid. You told us there was landscaping scheduled, but the county has no record of any permits filed. You told us dredging was coming, but not a single invoice exists. $25,000 doesn't just vanish, Marjorie. Where is it? The room erupted again. Some neighbors stood waving their own copies of Sophie's spreadsheets. Others shouted questions I knew Marjorie couldn't answer. Her once perfect composure cracked. Sweat beaded on her forehead. She stammered something about delays and paperwork in process, but the words sounded flimsy. Finally, one of the older residents, a retired judge named Mr. Hawkins, rose from his chair. His voice cut through the chaos like a gavel. Enough, he said. We've been misled. These financial discrepancies are serious. If Mrs. Kane cannot provide immediate documentation, then this matter must be escalated beyond the HOA. The crowd quieted, waiting for her reply. Marjorie's eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally. But the support she had once commanded was gone. Even her closest loyalists looked away. I'll get the records, she sputtered. I just need time. But it was too late. The county attorney, who had been invited after Sophie's anonymous tips, reached his office, stepped forward. You've had years, Mrs. Kane, he said firmly. This community deserves transparency. As of today, you are required to return all collected funds or face legal action for fraud and misrepresentation. Gasps rippled through the room. Marjorie's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Then, with shaking hands, she was presented with documents, a formal agreement demanding restitution within 30 days, a ban from serving on any HOA board for the next 5 years, and a pending investigation into potential tax evasion. I'll never forget the sound of her pen scratching against the paper as she signed her signature, trembling under the eyes of dozens of neighbors. The once untouchable queen of the lake stood exposed, cornered, and stripped of her authority. But it didn't end with the signatures. Over the next weekend, Marjorie was ordered to personally dismantle every false symbol of her control. She tore down HOA lake rules signs, pulled up stakes she had hammered into the ground, and removed unauthorized fencing she'd installed to create the illusion of boundaries. Watching her struggle under the supervision of her former followers was strangely satisfying, like seeing justice take physical form. Perhaps most humiliating of all, she was required to record a formal apology video. I stood in the back of the community center as she read from a script drafted by the county attorney, admitting she had misrepresented her authority, collected funds without oversight, and spread misinformation about me. The same channels she once used to smear my name now carried her confession. Neighbors who once avoided me now knocked on my door to apologize, some even offering to bring food or help with yard work. The isolation I'd felt for months evaporated almost overnight, and something even better happened. With Marjorie gone, the neighborhood began to heal. Residents came together to create a new system, a voluntary community fund managed transparently with rotating representatives. No one person could ever again wield unchecked power. Monthly meetings were open to all, with financial records published online for everyone to see. Projects were voted on collectively: dock repairs, new safety equipment, environmental protections for the lake. What shocked me most was how generous people became when fear was removed. The voluntary contributions actually exceeded what Marjorie had ever collected through intimidation. Neighbors donated time, money, and skills freely, knowing their voices mattered. The lake was repaired, the shoreline cleaned, and new life returned to the place my grandfather had loved. One evening, weeks later, I stood on the dock watching children splash in the shallows while their parents laughed and shared food nearby. Sophie joined me, her smile tired but genuine. "Looks different, doesn't it?" she said. "It feels different," I replied. "It feels ours. For real this time." I thought about everything we had endured, the flyers, the protests, the late-night flags planted in my yard. I thought about how close I came to giving up, to packing my bags and leaving the lake behind. And I realized something important. The real victory wasn't just proving ownership of the water. It was showing the community that truth mattered, that no one should be bullied into submission by loud voices and fake authority. Marjorie had nearly won. She'd built her power not on law but on fear, and for too long everyone, including me, let her get away with it. But fear only lasts until someone stands up and says, "Show me the proof." Now the lake is free. No fees, no fake rules. Just neighbors working together as it should have been all along. And as I leaned against the wooden post of the dock, watching the sun dip low across the water, I finally felt at peace, not because I owned the lake, but because I had fought for it and for the truth. This story isn't just about one lake or one HOA. It's about what happens when people surrender their voices to someone who thrives on fear and manipulation. Marjorie nearly convinced an entire community that lies were truth, that power was law. But the moment people demanded evidence, the facade collapsed. In life, there will always be voices like hers, loud, confident, dressed up in official language. But no matter how polished the lie, truth doesn't need theatrics. It only needs persistence. My grandfather's dusty files, Sophie's quiet determination, and a little courage turned the tide against years of intimidation. So if you've ever faced someone abusing fake authority, remember this: you're not powerless. Ask questions. Demand proof. Stand firm even when you stand alone, because sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to bow for a whole community to wake up. If this story struck a chord with you, I'd love to hear your own experiences in the comments. Share your battles, your victories, even your lessons learned. And don't forget to subscribe, because there are more stories like this, and together we can keep exposing the truth.